Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching.
We will make today a short summary of the 21st package of sanctions, which the European Union introduced with respect to Russia and Belarus on the 23rd of July 2026. And as we typically do in our presentations related to overview of new sanction packages, we would look at the composition of the package, blocking sanctions, and sectoral sanctions, where we would specifically focus on two key elements of such sectoral sanctions, namely energy sanctions and financial sector sanctions. Similar to previous packages, the package is introduced by both decisions made by the Council within the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the implementing regulations, which relate to the creation of binding obligations for natural persons and individuals within the territory of the European Union or otherwise having nexus to the European Union. This complex structure reflects on how the decision-making powers are exercised in the sanctions area within the European Union. As a practical matter, as it is the regulations and the implementing regulations which have the direct effect for companies and individuals, it is the text of these regulations which matters from the practical perspective. Similar to previous sanctions packages, in essence, mirror sanctions are introduced with respect to Belarus. And here the same principle applies. There is a decision made within the Common Foreign and Security Policy and the implementing regulations. And the reason why we have fewer documents with respect to Belarus is that there is no separation between blocking sanctions and the sectoral sanctions. They all combine in a single act, being Regulation 765, whereas with respect to Russia, there are two primary sanctions acts, Regulation 269 being the main blocking sanctions regulation, and Regulation 833 being the main sectoral sanctions regulations. We'll look first at the blocking sanctions. And in general terms, if there is one word which can describe the 21st sanctions package, then it would be fair to say that this word is derogation. Most of the elements which have been introduced in effect apply to derogations to existing prohibitions. The reason for that is that within the European Union, the derogations can be introduced only by way of amending the underlying regulations. They are not permitted at the level of the national competent authorities, with the result being that the sanctions regulations are often proved to be ineffective as a practical matter and requiring this type of subsequent amendments. In fairness, when we look at the derogations introduced within the 21st package, it's kind of difficult to think of any good reason why the legislator composed of all EU member states has to take care about this type of points. For example, we see derogations related to the enforcement of insurance claims against a Russian insurance company, which was subject to the blocking sanctions. So that's plainly a technical matter for the national competent authorities to address, but as the laws are structured, is actually dealt at the level of the regulation. There is surprisingly derogation which exempts the assets of the Russian railways, like rails themselves or the rolling stock, from attachment. Presumably in some jurisdictions, national competent authorities wanted to attach that stock, and that again required intervention at the EU level. Question is, what happened before this kind of derogation was introduced? Was the stock attached and now is actually freed from the relevant attachments? The answer is most likely no, but that's what we typically see here, is that the relevant regulation doesn't work as a practical matter, and then requires this type of amendments made month and month after the original restriction was introduced, just because of that inflexibility in terms of decision making. PAX 2, standard exemption. Hungary is building a nuclear power station largely relying on Russian technologies and requires cooperation with various Russian research and industrial institutions to bring this construction to the end. So that explains this type of exemption, again, appearing in the regulations. Surprisingly, the exemption even reflects some type of put option arrangement, which an EU operator had, it seems, with respect to the shares in Alfa Bank of Belarus. And to implement that put option arrangement, basically the indirect owners of the bank, which are subject to the EU blocking sanctions, will have their shareholdings increased, which means that they would have additional resources. But presumably, the exercise of that option was in the first place in the interest of this European operator affected by the option. Again, the only question which we have is that why this has to be dealt at the relevant level of the legislator. So all in all, I think these derogations, while helpful for some specific operators, which lobbied the national competent authorities to include them in this round of sanctions, changed nothing in the overall structure of the sanctions regime, and all in all just pose the questions as to general efficiency of this regime when sanctions are introduced against a large economy like Russia, and generally questions whether these derogations are feasible in terms of an efficient legislative structure if made by Council itself. The key with respect to the blocking sanctions are actually the new names which were designated, as one would expect the blocking sanctions would be. In effect, there are many large industrial groups which were designated as a part of the 21st sanctions package, including, for example, Interhour, which is the large Russian corporation controlling the energy networks as well as some energy facilities, both in Russia and within the European Union, for example, in the Baltics or in the Scandinavia. UGMK would be another notable example of a large mining conglomerate in Russia. Sistema, huge financial, industrial, and trading group, as well as financial sector, where more than 90 banks, by now largely of regional significance, have been designated to the EU blocking sanction, with the noteworthy exemption of Rossellhozbank, which is a large Russian state-owned bank of national importance. Despite these multiple designations, one has to take into account that some of those are already duplicative of existing restrictions. Rossellhozbank here would be one of the examples, which has been already subject by now for more than 3 years to so-called transaction ban, which in essence prohibits all type of transactions with Rossellhozbank except for a closed list of permitted transactions, largely related to servicing permitted Russian exports to the European Union. In case of Rossellhozbank, trade in agricultural goods and fertilizers would be the most obvious example. So being subject to that type of ban, arguably the blocking sanctions, which mean that the assets of Rossellhozbank, if any, within the European Union will be now blocked, arguably adds very little to the restrictions which are already in place. Same applies to other companies, at least some of them currently designated by name. For example, Sistema, the UBOR has been designated, and arguably the treatment of Sistema to a large extent would depend on the treatment of UBO by now within the European Union. So there are many names, but the real effect of this designation at this moment of time would be more to clarify the status of the relevant entities for the banks, for those operators which deal with them or their subsidiaries specifically, rather than presumably add substantially new amounts of blocked assets to the operations of those entities. With respect to the sectoral sanctions, one can say that the measures introduced are even more of clarificatory nature rather than changing anything of substance. Most important measure, which was widely described in press, is the suspension of oil price cap adjustment, a mechanism which was supposed to operate in a way that it would fluctuate depending on the price of oil and oil products, which under the current prices, which have substantially increased since the start of war in Iran, would require the upward adjustment of the oil price cap. So this upward adjustment has been suspended, and the oil price caps, which are three, one for crude, one for petroleum products, trading at premium and a discount to crude, remain the same. The oil price cap for crude of $44.1 de facto means that EU operators and EU insurance companies, EU operators of the vessels, EU crews will be barred from transferring Russian oil to the third countries where this is permitted, subject to compliance with the oil price cap. Given that the current price of oil is substantially higher than this price cap, even taking into account the relevant discounts of the Russian oil trades. With respect to oil price cap, the point which I think is noteworthy and we need to take into account is the clear divergence between the European policy and the policy of, for example, the United States, which, given the current situation with the oil markets, suspended the application of national sanctions with respect to Russian crude and petroleum products delivered by sea. So not only the United States do not keep the oil price cap at a lower level, but they suspend any price cap altogether. Take into account that oil price cap is supposed to operate on a global level within G7, where certainly US and the US market is one of the key players, as well as the EU, Australia, Japan, and Canada. This de facto means that the business which is currently operated, for example, by the Greek or Cypriot owners and operators of shipping industry will move to the United States operators. New vessels were designated to the so-called shadow fleet designations, which in essence means that these vessels cannot have access to the European Union ports and obtain largely services from the EU operators. Again, in the context of more than 600 ships been designated so far, this is an expected but marginal measure. Any operator in this area certainly is advised to check the vessel's list attached to the regulation carefully to ensure that it doesn't provide prohibited services to any of those vessels. What's interesting are actually the derogations which were introduced to the regulation. Surprisingly, some of them actually toned down the ban on LNG services and dealing in Russian LNG, which is supposed to become operational. By way of most notable exception, the LNG ban was supposed to operate in a way that the EU operators cannot certainly export LNG from Russia into EU under short-term contract, the prohibition which is effective since April, and then longer-term contract, the prohibition which becomes effective by the end of the year. And this type of prohibition was operational worldwide. So the difference between oil price cap and LNG is that an EU operator, for example, transporting Russian crude from Russia to, for example, China, is permitted to do so to the extent it is compliant with the oil price cap. No such rules apply to LNG, whereby an EU operator, manager of a ship, insurance company, bank, will be prohibited to deal with the transportation, sale, purchase, or any other transactions with Russian LNG, regardless of the point of its destination. That's an important distinction, highly publicized at the time it was adopted, and as it proved to be quite impossible for some European member states to accept. Greece negotiated the exception for one of its entrepreneurs who has long-term contracts for the supply of Russian LNG to third-party jurisdictions and who appeared on reflection to be unwilling to accept this type of restriction on its operations. The result being that the derogation is introduced to the dealing in Russian LNG for EU operators, which had pre-existing contracts and which want to continue the supply of this LNG to third-party jurisdictions. Derogations is drafted in quite detailed manner, being a clear indication that it just reflects the interests of a very specific operator. Another noteworthy example in the sectoral sanctions with respect to Russian energy sector is the suspended future transaction ban on Kolevi oil refinery, which is a refinery located in Georgia, which business model to a large extent recently was to buy Russian crude, increase the purchase of Russian crude and supply it to those markets, which continue to purchase Russian crude at the market rate. Georgia is by far not the biggest participant in this type of operations. We've discussed these in our previous sessions, and we pointed that India is by far the biggest market where Russian crude is refined and then petroleum products is supplied to those jurisdictions which are willing to supply these products. China, Turkey operates refineries. And in this sense, it's important to know 2 points. That first of all, Georgia is by far not the biggest country which continues to deal in Russian crude. And second of all, that there is no report being made that Georgia supplies somehow inadvertently the petroleum products produced by Russian crude to the European market, where these would be prohibited. In fairness, in the first place to the European operators, which permit such supply. In this sense, the threatened introduction of transaction ban sanctions against the Kolevi oil refinery seems to be a clear example of the departure of the European Union from so-called territorial effect of the sanctions. We have discussed this previously, and by way of brief summary, the position of the European Union compared to most notably the United States has always been that national sanctions have to be territorial in nature, meaning that they should apply only to the extent there is nexus to the European Union, either in terms of territory of the European Union being involved in the application of the sanctions, or the EU persons being involved in the relevant sanctions dealings. And the European Union strongly condemned the attempt of the United States to regulate transactions which have no contact whatsoever with the US jurisdiction either because of the US territory or the US person being involved. So here, with respect to Kulevi, we see a clear departure of the European Union from its territorial approach towards the sanctions. There's no report that this oil refinery is doing anything which gets either EU banks, EU insurance companies, EU transportation companies involved. Arguably, even to the extent this company is involved, that's their responsibility under EU regulation in the first place. So what this refinery is doing is that it basically refines Russian oil and sells it to those markets which are willing to accept petroleum products produced from Russian oil. And this EU tries to prohibit, which in essence makes it identical to what the United States are doing. Financial sector sanctions of the 21st sanctions package largely replicate the previous package. We have additional regional banks being added to the transaction ban. This is basically the same group of banks already subject to blocking sanctions. Given that the transaction ban is a milder measure than the blocking sanctions, this measure adds nothing to the regulatory status of these institutions. And in fairness, as we've already discussed previously, the current flow of funds between the European Union and Russia, to the extent there is any, basically already for a very long period of time, for more than 3 years, does not rely on any small regional Russian banks for any of such payments. Big Russian banks have been largely cut off the European market already in 2022. And those which were not formally cut off from the European market have been cut off due to internal compliance policies of the relevant big financial institutions which provided the corresponding banking service to the Russian banks. So by now, the relevant routes are largely directed to the actually European banks still present and operational in the Russian market, their subsidiaries operational there, or the third-party jurisdictions which are not following the EU sanctions program against Russia. So again, we can say that this designation is, for all these reasons, is repetitive and unlikely to make any meaningful impact. We see here, similar to Kulevi, the tendency of the European Union to embrace the extraterritorial application of their sanctions, meaning that the cryptocurrency platforms and financial institutions located outside of the European Union jurisdiction are continuously designated to the transaction ban. And this tendency is continuing in the 21st package. At least formally, there is no report that all of them were somehow involved specifically in the circumvention of the EU sanctions, for example, in organizing payments for parallel imports or exports to or from the European Union. Many of them, at least on the basis of publicly available information and the reasons for their designation, continue to support Russia, but in its trade with third-party jurisdictions unrelated to the European Union. So in this sense, again, we see the trend which we discussed with respect to oil refinery, where it's basically much easier for us to analyze and consider whether the European Union is really involved with respect to cryptocurrency providers and third-party jurisdiction banks. That's the analysis which certainly is difficult to make on the basis of public information. But at least there is strong suggestion that that's the example of European sanctions program becoming more and more extraterritorial in its nature, with the relevant consequences which such extraterritorial application is likely to entail, namely the response sanctions from those third-party jurisdictions which are affected by these measures, which is likely to happen in the foreseeable future. A useful exemption was introduced again to make this transaction ban workable. By way of reminder, transaction ban, as discussed, works in a way that all transactions are prohibited. There is no asset freeze. So to the extent the relevant assets somewhat arrive within the territory of the European Union, they need to be returned back. First of all, we talk about money here. They should not be frozen. So all transactions are prohibited except for a limited list of permitted transactions, and those would typically relate to those exemptions which are available for the release of blocked funds. Notably, there was no exemption allowing the EU nationals to withdraw their funds from the relevant financial institutions, which made this type of withdrawal a prohibited transaction and adversely and inadvertently affected the relevant EU nationals. So this exemption, which is limited in time, has been introduced and may be useful for those EU, Swiss, European Economic Area, or partner jurisdictions nationals who, for some reason, had some of the assets located with these institutions. Final note were the elements of the 21st sanctions related to the regulations of import and exports. Here again, we have standard addition of new items to the list. By now, it's worthy to say that any kind of trade operations with Russia would require careful consideration on item per item basis to ensure compliance. There is a standard, again, extension of timing for the divestments of EU operators from Russia. All in all, this divestment is blocked to a large extent by huge Russian payout taxes, which basically make this divestment economically unviable for the EU operators. So it's unlikely that this extension will help this divestment in any sensible way or form. There is a helpful exemption introduced to the prohibition to provide tourist services to Russia with respect to the computerized reservation systems. And there is a exemption for the prohibition to accept public funding from Russian entities for the education and research purposes, which singles out specific programs within the European Union, which are co-funded by Russia at the intergovernmental level. Again, all in all, pretty technical restrictions and derogations aimed at making the current regulations workable, improving its functionality, rather than introducing some substantial restrictions or the other way around, mitigations to the current regime. Thank you very much for watching. I trust you found this summary useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.